Hello, this is David with the Reformed Apologist channel. Today we are discussing the secular agenda once more to follow up from previous videos and discussing the false caliphate that is a consequence of the horrible thinking of these people who are following along unthinkingly with this secular agenda and are in lockstep with it sometimes, even unwittingly or are self-deceived or whatever. It is a deceptive agenda with deceptive tools and practices. They believe everyone has to be controlled by physical means and take their medicine and so forth. Well, where did that idea come from? Where did all this come from? Where did this secular thinking originate? Who is at the top of the food chain? Who is leading everyone along in that? Into sin, into a false worldview, an unchristian, unbiblical worldview. Who's leading that? Well, the first time we see anything like that is the fall of man, Genesis chapter 3, where Adam and Eve are seduced by the serpent into ideas that are not with God anymore. They're led to think, and just to put it in different terms, that they're led to think that they could have something apart from God, something for themselves. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 4, the serpent convinced the woman when he said, "You surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." End quote. They wanted to have their own thing, separate from. They wanted to have their own way of doing things. They wanted to have their own faculties opened up so they could be like God themselves. So I really think that whole separation of church and state, as we call it, not that it's that bad of a system of government in America, but the secular ideas definitely begin at the point of the fall of man. There's no doubt about it. Now we have, well, in many things. Now we have in many things. Science, for example, you have there is secular science and there is Christian science. There's secular psychology and Christian psychology. Those splits originate there as far as I'm concerned. So basically, to get back down to it again, when you look at what I was talking about, for example, the pharmaceutical industry is about money and making money and profiting. They wanted to make medications like Wrigley's gum so that every American citizen could be prescribed a medication for whatever is wrong with them, whether it be mental or physical. The mental angle is an interesting one. Definitely. Since the secular agenda is money-driven, then the one at the utmost top of the food chain behind all of that is the devil himself. Okay, and let's not go there. Whether the devil is chained up in the abyss, how long the chain, basically. The church, the people in church, Christians, should not be participating in a false secular caliphate. I was talking about church discipline last time. I've been over it with people. The terms like madness, insane, and lunacy do have biblical anthropology. In other words, we see them used in common usage terms in the Bible, in the scriptures. They're reasonable as descriptors, therefore in conversation. All right. However, Jesus Christ, New Testament, taught us to not judge by appearances. We're taught to have compassion, to love one another. So why would people be just frivolously throwing around those terms? I'm not saying everyone does that. I'm not saying that those I talked with recently do that. But people shouldn't be just using those terms oh so loosely in what is actually an oppressive mental health regime. And I know it depends on what state, what locality you live in. But in some places, there's definitely an oppressive mental health regime supported by the justice system. So why be so quick and loose in your tongue to judge one another and throw around those kind of terms when you don't know what's going on with someone? We know, for example, that a mere physical illness could cause mental unwellness. You could have. Everyone knows this. You could have the flu and not be yourself. You're not going to talk the same if you have a severe flu. Well, talking is behavior, right? Was that the flu is hindering you. If you have the flu or a cold, that's hindering you. Your body's hindering you. Okay. Furthermore, people get so even in church, they get so behavioral oriented and tend to think in that capacity level, according to behavioral science, it's no good. Behavioral science has its roots in atheism. For example, someone who's crazy, like they're ranting and raving level and talking incoherently, that's not the same level of insanity as like the slightest twitch of someone, sitting in a church pew. Like, let's say they have like one instance of like a facial twitch. Okay, do we call that person insane? Like, how far are you going to go on people? I don't think so. Or let's say that they happen to turn their head possibly to the left once without explanation. Now you're going to judge someone for turning their head to the left once without explanation. That's their behavior, right? Okay, is that to be behaviorally medically controlled? So what? Did they harm anyone? Okay, so how antiseptic are you going to be? It's ridiculous. People should be exercising Christian principles and leadership principles in their decisions, the way they talk about others. You can't be throwing those terms around just so lightly. It's not because it's not according to biblical anthropology, it's the ethics and morals involved. You don't want to be saying that about someone who's not actually insane. Okay. For example, you could base what you're saying on a label, but do you want to do that? Because the biblical way is to judge a righteous judgment. Okay, we know insanity when we see it. You'd want to judge a righteous judgment and get all the facts before you just say things. Okay. People can have labels put on them that last for years. Well, is that person currently functioning or what? You don't call someone not of a sound mind if they're currently able to talk, think, and reason and act normally. That would be slandering that person. That's against God's law, specifically the command which says to not bear false witness against your neighbor. So the Christian principles and leadership principles, we're talking about the weightier provisions of the law. Matthew 23:23, Jesus said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. But these are things you should have done without neglecting the others, you blind guides who strain out a net and swallow a camel." Okay? To be so persnickety and to be so down in the details is being like a Pharisee. What we want is the Christian principles, the weightier provisions of the law, the things that are the broader scope and way of handling people, which has not only justice but mercy, compassion, and those things. The money-changing enterprise at the temple at the time of Christ was defensible biblically if you have a stiff-necked position, basically, from the Bible. If you want to interpret everything with a stiff-necked approach where everything's legalistic and you have no heart for God, you could create that idea and say that that's okay to do, basically. No wonder Jesus drove them out and turned over the tables. Okay. I've been through most of the Bible verses that have those words, madness, insanity, and so forth. And I have the list. How many of these are actually commands for a consequence that men should give if someone's insane, or commands that say men should declare someone insane? Actually, none of them that I have are that. I mean, they don't occur in the civil ordinances where people are given a provision which says what to do to a person as a consequence. It doesn't have that. We're just talking about biblical anthropology, which was just a common usage of a word. So basically, I mean, that study shows you could reasonably use those words, but I question the ethics and morals involved in terms of jumping so quickly to a judgment, or jumping so quickly to conclusions in the midst of a harmful secular system. There are problematic ethics and morals involved. Jesus said in John chapter 7, verse 24, do not to judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. My discussions with others have gone to the level of discussing mind-body connection and those things. And that's part of biblical studies and theology, also in Christian philosophy. It does touch upon salvific issues. A lot of you are holding to some kind of compatibilism, and in this view, the free will of man is compatible with determinism. It's a way of combining the two ideas. But what you're doing is you are trying to say that thoughts originate with the physical body, the physical brain, but that God's power and God's sovereignty interferes or is involved. All right. And of course, that's getting close to naturalism and materialism. But I know some great Christian thinkers have held to compatibilism. The problem is, what I see as being a problem potentially is the abuse of this position to say that people necessarily need psych meds to fix their condition. I don't know how you can even say that with Christian compatibilism if God is that involved. If people's will, etc., or their volition and their thinking is by God's sovereignty, then why the psych meds? If you're just saying that thoughts originate from the physical brain, basically, and the mind is tied to that, or the mind is tied to the physical, what happens in the physical, you are saying something which is also trying to say that your psych meds will help you, will help your mind, basically. I don't hold to that. I hold to occasionalism, and I get my view of occasionalism from having read Vincent Chung's books, basically. So I hold to occasionalism in my view of mind and body, basically. Let me get up my web browser. Occasionalism, to give the generic definition, is supposed to be a theory about causation, but it does touch upon mind-body connection, the constitution of man, anthropology, and so forth. One of the generic definitions just says created substances cannot be efficient causes of events, basically. In my point of view, basically, thoughts are not originating in your physical brain. Thoughts are not originating in anyone's brain. It's coming from your non-physical mind, okay? And ultimately from God. God is the cause of all events. So God is making your thoughts be there in your mind and making your brain patterns have the patterns they have at the same time, basically. I can read the definition directly from Vincent Chung's book, Captive to Reason, the definition that he gives, or the way he talks about it. These can be found on the internet, his books anyway. He says, and I quote, "For example, I do not believe, one, that a concept is physical, and I do not believe, two, that brains think at all. Rather, thinking occurs in the incorporeal mind, and the mind continues to think when it separates from the body at death." Okay, let me skip down. He says, "My position is that God's providence includes complete control of everything, about everything, which means that he must be the sole power controlling all communication and knowledge acquisition. Using the brain as an illustration, if there is any relation between the brain and thinking, it would mean that on the occasion that God causes a thought in the mind, he also causes activity in the brain, and on the occasion that he causes activity in the brain, he also causes a thought in the mind. The brain has no necessary and consistent relationship with thinking. Thinking can be done apart from it. At death, God separates a person's mind from his body and thus also from his brain. God continues to cause thoughts in the person's mind, but on those occasions that he does this, he no longer causes any corresponding activity in the brain that used to be associated with this person's mind. Jonathan Edwards affirmed a form of occasionalism, and also Malebranche, as well as a number of other Christian thinkers. You could see Calvin, Luther, etc. at times saying things that sound like occasionalism. In any case, it is unimportant who affirms it or who rejects it. It is nothing less than a necessary implication and a consistent application of the biblical doctrine of providence. So I basically hold, okay, that's end quote. I basically hold to the same thing as that, as what I just said and read from Vincent Chung, okay? I'm just concerned that some are deceived in the worldview they're holding because their view of compatibilism and mind-body and the constitution of man and mind-body connection, they're deceiving themselves and holding to something that is so close to naturalism that their worldview does not pass the test for the preconditions of intelligibility. They can say all they want to. They're holding to Calvinism and so forth and Orthodox, Christianity. But if they get so naturalistic in their thinking and so materialist that everything's just coming from brains when people talk and reason and think and make decisions and act, then it gets down to the point of saying, well, man, does your worldview there pass the preconditions of intelligibility?